This is study number 5, and we're going to be in Genesis 32, 22 to 32. This is the passage where Jacob wrestles with God. So let me read that for us really quick. It says, "The same night he arose and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. Jacob was left alone. And the man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, 'Let me go, for the day is broken.' But Jacob said, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' And he said to him, 'What's your name?' And he said, 'Jacob.' Then he said, 'Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed.' Then Jacob asked him, 'Please tell me your name.' But he says, 'Why is it that you ask my name?' And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, 'For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered.' The sun rose upon him as he passed Peniel, limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the people of Israel do not eat the sinew of the thigh that is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip on the sinew of the thigh." The last study was with Rachel and Leah, and how Jacob married both of his wives. There's a bunch that we skipped, which was basically about how Jacob basically worked for Laban, the 7 additional years for Rachel. And then after that, Laban still wanted him to continue working for him because everything Jacob did, God blessed him. And he had tons of, flocks just multiplying, that type of thing. So he made a deal with Laban about if any spotted or striped animals, livestock, goats and sheep, Jacob would get to keep for himself as his wages, and then all the pure ones, the clean ones, can go to Laban. And so then Laban tried to trick Jacob by immediately removing all of those speckled and striped goats and sheep from the fields. But Jacob did this weird thing about like peeling the bark of some things. But basically, it was like some sort of like visual aid, they say, to help the animals multiply, and then or to produce striped and speckled goats and sheep. But the goats and sheep that came out a lot of them were speckled and striped. So then even though Laban tried to remove them, he still got a lot of speckled or livestock that became his. Now, we know that just showing some sheep some striped bark won't make it like produce striped offspring. So, and I think Jacob recognizes that too. So it even says that, Jacob recognized that God's the one who was blessing him, not necessarily because he made this, I don't know. But anyway, that's a little bit of a confusing story, but you can read about it in the previous chapter. And then, so eventually Jacob's like, okay, it's time for me to go home. I'm really rich now. I have 2 wives, I have a bunch of kids. I'm going to go home. So he's going home, and he's like anticipating meeting Esau, and that's the scene of this story where he's sending everyone else ahead, and then he was left alone, and he goes to sleep, and then he starts wrestling with this man, right? Well, it doesn't say he goes to sleep, actually. But anyways, so he's wrestling with this man, and the man tells him, "Hey, let me go. It's daytime already." And Jacob says, "I'm not going to let you go," those kind of things, right? And then he touches his hip. His hip is injured, gets the blessing, and turns out the guy is God. The man is God. So a couple things. First of all, the identity of the man, it's perfect. The Bible keeps saying the man, right? In the beginning, it's like the man did not prevail against Jacob. He started wrestling with a man. So it's just a person. And part of the story is, who is this guy? Who is this man? That's part of the question. Now we know, okay, at the end it turns out to be God, right? But In the story, part of it is, who is this guy and why is Jacob wrestling with him? And then it says, and then they have the entire thing about them asking about the names, right? So Jacob's like, I'm not, God or the man asks Jacob, what is your name? And your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel. And then Jacob asks him, please tell me your name. And the man doesn't tell him his name, right? But Jacob still concludes that it's God and that he's seen God face to face. And now the identity of who this person is actually very important. The identity of Jacob is also very important. That Jacob all his life has been struggling against Esau. Esau is the man, right? So in this element, in this situation here, he's struggling and fighting. He thinks he's going to confront Esau soon. So that's what it represents. But it turns out that the man, the people, he struggled against Laban, right? It was also a man. But it turns out it's not that he was fighting against Esau and Laban. He's really been struggling with God the entire time. So part of the message here is that when we think we're struggling against, fighting for the blessing, fighting for different things against people, really, these things God controls, and he wants us, and he's putting us in this place where we're struggling because we need to find God himself. And so Jacob discovers at the end, oh wait, I haven't actually, my whole life, I haven't been struggling against Esau and Laban. It's not about them. It's actually about my relationship with God. And that's like kind of the big revelation here. So in ancient culture and ancient Hebrew culture, the name is very important to the person's identity. And knowing the name and having the name and being able to call someone by the name represents some sort of power that you have over that person. If you can call in the New Testament, when Jesus calls certain demons by their name, then that it represents like some sort of power that he has over them. So here, God asking Jacob for his name and then changing his name really represents the authority that God has over Jacob. And Jacob recognizes that the man that he's wrestling with is somebody way up there. Okay, maybe he thinks it's an angel. He doesn't know who it is. And that's part of the story. It's like, who is this guy? And when the guy doesn't actually give Jacob his name, Jacob's like, oh man, I've seen God face to face. Because it says directly, but why is it that you asked my name? And there he blessed him. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, for I have seen God face to face. So by the man not saying his name and saying, why do you ask me my name? Jacob knows that is actually God. That is God himself. So it's pretty crazy. And from that, he's like, I've seen God face to face. This is verse 30, and yet my life has been delivered. So he's like, oh man, I actually wrestled with God. That's freaking scary. That's like, why did I do that? That's not something you should be doing, right? So he recognizes his place in front of God, and that God has actually shown him a lot of mercy. Okay, so those are some interesting points there. Also, the hip socket thing. Why is the hip socket thing important? And so he's wrestling with God, and the hip becomes disjointed, right? He dislocated, and then he comes out of the wrestling match. He still wins the wrestling match, but he comes out of the wrestling match with a dislocated hip, indicating, hey, this is a reminder that you wrestle with God, and actually God is super powerful, and he could have easily won this wrestling match. But what happened? What happened was that that's a reminder that God invited the wrestling. It's like, yeah, wrestle with me. You're not really supposed to wrestle with God, but it's in his mercy that he says, hey, wrestle with me, contend with me, argue with me, fight with me. And that's what Jacob has been doing his entire life. He hasn't been submitting to God. He's not a guy who just says, okay, God, I'm just going to worship you. your God, I'm not going to ask any demands. No, he's like wrestling. He's like, give me that blessing. I want that blessing. He's still grappling, right? Remember, Jacob's name means to grasp at the heel or to grab, right? So he's still grappling with God, still wrestling with him. And he's demanding the blessing, right? And God is saying, God in the wrestling match allows that wrestling. He's like, God, or Jacob, you can wrestle with me. And I'm going to be merciful to you. I'm going to give you this blessing that you really want. And it's a really interesting dynamic because God doesn't shut him down. God invites this wrestling, right? On top of that, this is a moment right before he meets Esau. So he's very worried that everything he has is going to be gone. Everything that he has his wife, his kids, he has wealth, right? God's been blessing him, but he's still worried that Esau's going to come in and kill him. So that's like a big deal here in this passage too. So that's why he's like, I need this. I need this, right? And God, I'm not going to let God go. I'm not going to let this man go until I get the blessing. And God shows him through the wrestling, through all of this time, that hey, it's not just you trying to grab the blessing. It's actually me giving it to you. And you think you're grabbing it. You think you're just taking it from me. But really, I'm the one giving it to you. Jacob thinks all his life that he's been getting the blessing. He's been smart. He's been like shrewd, and he's manipulated his life to get all the blessing. Just like he's like, I'm gonna hold God down. But at the end of the day, he realizes I wrestled God. God could have easily killed me. I didn't do anything. And that's a reflection on Jacob's entire life, that he's been wrestling with God, and at the end of the day, he's gotten all this blessing, but he realizes, oh, it's not actually me who got any of this. God, in his mercy, is giving it to me. And he's just allowing me to think that I wrestled with him or that I grabbed it. But it's not really that I'm grabbing it. And so he changes his name from Jacob to Israel, saying, you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. So the name Jacob means like grasping, or even deceiving. But Israel is a very good connotation name. And Jacob's kind of like, you don't really, that's a kind of a bad name actually. I mean, now obviously we really admire Jacob because of the way he did seek out God. But so now the name has good connotations. But back then, Jacob may have been kind of a weird name, right? Kind of a negative name. But he changes his name to Israel, meaning you're striving after God. You're pursuing him. You're chasing him. You're grabbing onto him. And God's telling him in all his life, he's not just striving with men and trying to grab things from it. He's wrestling with God. And that's what God actually really wants. And so for us, I think God, and this is the application, God kind of invites us to strive with him, to wrestle with him. What do you want in life? What are the things that you want? And can you bring those to God? It's not necessarily that God's actually just like gonna give it all to you or give it to you the way that you want. But God wants you to contend with him. God wants you to fight with him. God wants you to say, God, go to him as the source and say, hey, these are the things in my life. Are you gonna give them to me? And he wants us to seek him like that. And God's going to pull us. And he's going to wrestle with us. And say, just like he did with Jacob. And he's like, challenge me, even face to face, right? And God's strong enough to withstand those challenges. But afterwards, you see Jacob, he goes away like really humbled. I think part of the danger is like we challenge God, we attack God, we don't have respect for him. Right? We don't have fear for him. That's not what Jacob goes away with. Jacob goes away with like very fearful, like, I cannot believe I did this in front of God. And that's kind of the attitude that we need to have, is that this God who can easily kill us, destroy us, loves us and invites us to pursue him, to chase him down, to strive after him.